Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first of 3 webinars on retail apprenticeship reform, moving from SACE to standards. Now, this is, like I said, a series of 3 webinars. So today is looking at an overview of apprenticeship reform. So apologies to any of you who may have heard some of this content before, but it doesn't hurt to hear it again. The next webinar next week will be looking at on-programme delivery and assessment. And then the following week commencing the 22nd of May, we'll be focusing on endpoint assessment to do with the new standards. So it looks like most of you are from a private training provider, and again, most of you have delivered SACE apprenticeships, but the majority of you are looking at starting the new apprenticeships this academic year or within the next couple of months. Okay, so what are we going to go through today? So today we're going to look at what the requirements for the new apprenticeship standards are. We're going to look at on-programme delivery and assessment in a very brief overhead view. The same with endpoint assessment. We're going to look at the differences between SACE and standards so you can understand the differences and the similarities, because there are some, and also looking at funding. So, the requirements for the new apprenticeship standards. So some of you may be aware that back in 2013, well, possibly 2012, 2013, there was a review led by a gentleman called Doug Richards into the delivery of apprenticeships in the UK, predominantly England, but looking at some of the apprenticeships in the UK. And he came up with a series of recommendations that was known as the Richard Review, and the government published their response to the Richard Review back in October 2013. Some of the main tenements of the review was that apprenticeships as they are currently not fit for purpose according to employers, and that there needed to be an overhaul of the apprenticeship system to not only align it to what employers actually need from an apprentice and from future workforce, but also to align it more to what's happening in post-16 education as well. So some of the key criteria are that it's designed by employers for employers. So a group of employers will get together and they will decide what is needed for an occupation within their sector. So in retail, we're looking at retail team leader or supervisor, retail manager, and someone who is a retailer. Again, as with current apprenticeships, we wanted to make sure, or the Richard Review and employers wanted to make sure that there was some rigour attached to this, and they wanted to make sure that it was a minimum of 12 months on programme delivery and assessment. So that's quite critical for the apprenticeships, much like it is now, that they have to be at least 12 months in length. One of the new requirements was that actually they wanted somebody independently from the employer and the training provider to confirm occupational competence of that apprentice. And by this, they decided to create something called an endpoint assessment, and we'll go into that in more detail shortly. There's a requirement, as there is now, for off-the-job training, and they're stipulating at the moment it's a mandatory 20% off-the-job training, and that actually that there has to be an employer cash contribution. At the moment, with SACE apprenticeships, there is a requirement where it is a co-funded apprenticeship that there is a 50% cash contribution, or contribution in kind. This now moves to a mandatory cash contribution. Up until the 1st of May, this was actually a 33% contribution. It is now a 10%, and apologies, there's a slight typo on that slide where it says 10% of levy contribution. It should be a 10% contribution or 100% levy contribution. And we'll come on to the levy in a bit. And again, requirements which are slightly different, and the final couple of slides will cover this in more detail. There aren't actually any mandatory qualifications with the exception of English and maths, and there is a requirement for either functional skills or GCSE to be completed as part of the apprenticeship programme. Now, originally the government had planned to have everything in place by July 2017, so 2 months' time, and that they planned to withdraw all SACE apprenticeships at this point and have everybody move over to apprenticeship standards. For those of you that work across different sectors and not just in the retail sector, you may be aware that actually the development of new standards isn't quite going to plan. So they have extended that timeline to 2020, so by the end of the current Parliament, obviously not the one that's going to be put in place in June, but by 2020 they're hoping to have all SACE frameworks closed by 2020. They have actually started to switch off apprenticeship frameworks already in some sectors, those where there either have been no apprenticeship starts or completions or very limited apprenticeship starts and completions, and they started in 2016, and the volume of those switch-offs are starting to pick up pace. And they are looking at the moment where there is a direct replacement for a SACE apprenticeship, they are looking at switching off the existing framework. So, looking at on-programme delivery and assessment. As I said in the last slide, there aren't any mandatory qualifications. What providers are required to do are to design the delivery around the requirements of the apprenticeship standards. So if you look in the apprenticeship standard, which is a 2-page document, it will list all of the knowledge, skills and behaviours required for somebody to be deemed occupationally competent in that specific job role. Now, within the retail standard, obviously there is a very large list of sections, including brand awareness, including visual merchandising, including finance and customer service. And within that, there are a host of different elements that a candidate will need to be able to demonstrate competency against. And this is what you will have to design your training programs around. There will also be behaviours which, in current SACE terminology, would probably equate to your personal learning and thinking skills. And these are slightly more advanced personal learning and thinking skills now, so the behaviours will be things that candidates will be expected to demonstrate. So yes, it could be things like team working and communication, but it will cover things like honesty, integrity and trustworthiness and ethical responsibilities as well. And this is all outlined in the standard. As I said earlier, it has to take a minimum of 12 months, with at least 20% of this being delivered off the job. So if we look at a 12-month period, we're looking at approximately 9.5 weeks across the whole 12-month period. And this will be being monitored, and funding may be removed for providers that are not delivering the 20% off the job. And again, we'll go into more detail of the on-programme delivery and assessment and the off-the-job requirements in the next presentation next week. Standards, like I said, outline the minimum requirements to meet the job role. Employers can add additional requirements to the training programme, and they have to pay for these additionally because the funding only covers the training and delivery and assessment required to meet the needs of the standard. Anything in addition, above and beyond that listed in the standard, has to be paid for by the employer on top of. So, mandatory qualifications, why aren't there any? Well, the government decided that the apprenticeship certificate itself should be the qualification. It should be seen to be the standard, the requirement as the apprenticeship, rather than anything within the apprenticeship standard being certificated. There are frameworks out there, apprenticeship standards, that are funded as part, with qualifications funded as part of the apprenticeship standard. And this is where it's deemed to be a license to practice, for example, adult social care, or where there's a significant health and safety risk and transferability requirements of employers, for example, within engineering. So, an employer group can add qualifications to a standard, but it is the exception rather than the rule. So as I said earlier, training providers, you'll need to design a scheme of work or a lesson plan, sets of lesson plans with the employer to cover all of the knowledge, skills and behaviours. Now, what there is that's available on the People First website are some employer occupational briefs. So you have the standard and assessment plan on the government website, and this is what we as an endpoint assessment organisation will be designing the endpoint assessment requirements against. But the employer occupational brief contains additional information for you as providers to assist you in designing your training program, schemes of work for delivery against the standards. Now again, qualifications can be delivered as part of this standard, but you cannot be funded for that qualification. So the training against the standard can be funded, but the registration and certification costs of a qualification are not fundable. So again, you need to bear that in mind when you have discussions with employers. There will be a requirement by you as a training provider to enter into a contract with the employer which outlines all the requirements of the training program and the on-program assessment if necessary, and also the endpoint assessment. And again, there'll be a separate contract that the employer and yourself, the training provider, will enter into with your chosen endpoint assessment organisation. The thing to say here is, although they're called apprenticeship standards, there's actually nothing really standard about it. With SACE, we had a framework in which an apprenticeship was designed against. We had a knowledge component, a competency component, maths and English components, and employer rights and responsibilities, and personal learning and thinking skills. With an apprenticeship standard, there is nothing standard. An employer has, or an employer group, have the ability within a set of parameters to design an apprenticeship program to meet their specific needs, which is good, but also quite difficult if you work across numerous occupational areas and have to try and understand what it is you're delivering against each. Moving on to endpoint assessment. So, endpoint assessment. Why? Well, it is a new element of the apprenticeships and it's designed to confirm occupational competence. In some respects, it's also aligning apprenticeship delivery with the style of academic qualifications, for example, GCSEs and A-levels, where you have an assessment taking place at the end of the programme. And if you look at traditional and new A-levels, where you no longer have that midpoint assessment activity, you may have some coursework elements towards the overall grade, but the final grade is largely determined by the endpoint assessment or the exams that you do at the end. So they're trying to align apprenticeship provision with academic provision as well, to say actually an apprenticeship is not a lower standard of education than somebody doing an academic or vocational qualification. So there is some alignment happening within post-16 education to ensure that there is parity across the different types of provision. So the employers set the endpoint assessment and they design the endpoint assessment with their needs in mind. It is carried out by an independent organisation that's been approved by the Education Skills Funding Agency. The new name for the Skills Funding Agency, for those of you in the post-16 world, has now been a merger of the EFA and the SFA. So they're now called the ESFA. Great. So yeah, in order to be an endpoint assessment organisation, yes, you have to apply and be approved by them to go onto the register. And again, we'll cover more of this in the endpoint assessment webinars on the 22nd of May. So like I said before, on the on-programme, it does differ according to apprenticeship standard. There is no standard approach, and different occupational groups have different forms of endpoint assessment. And activities that we've seen across the sectors so far within an endpoint assessment include knowledge testing, either by on-screen or paper-based, multiple choice or short answer, observations within the workplace, business projects, professional discussions, interviews, timed challenges, practical activities. So there's a whole host of different methods of endpoint assessment. There is a gateway process that a candidate will have to go through prior to starting their endpoint assessment, where the employer has that agreement with the training provider that they both agree that the candidate in their mind is competent in the role that they are being asked to carry out, and that actually they are ready for endpoint assessment. If one party doesn't agree at that point that the candidate is ready for endpoint assessment, then the candidate should not be put forward for endpoint assessment until all parties are in agreement that that candidate is competent and stands a chance of actually passing that endpoint assessment. Endpoint assessment is a significant cost and a significant part of the apprenticeship. And again, if a candidate fails an endpoint assessment, there will be a resit available, but again, that will be at a cost. And that cost can be up to 20% of the overall funding. So again, it needs to be beared in mind that actually a candidate should only be put forward for endpoint assessment when they are ready, and that is when everybody deems them to be ready. Like I said earlier, there isn't a standard approach to EPA, but retail, just to give you an idea, so retail's level 2, 3 and 4. So retailer, retail team leader and retail manager. So retail team leader is a level 3 standard and a retail manager is a level 4. All have very similar apologies, I just had a message come through. All have very similar endpoint assessment activities. So the endpoint assessment activities are a knowledge test, which will either be multiple choice or short answer depending on the level, a practical observation in the workplace, and also a professional discussion stroke interview at the end. Now, the observation and the knowledge test can be carried out. They have to be carried out in that order. So knowledge test followed by practical observation, followed by professional discussion. So that's the way it needs to go, and obviously each element ideally will be booked in with the independent assessor beforehand. So I have just had a question sent through, so I'll just break off and just answer this because it seems quite a pertinent question. And the question is about the delivery with the SACE and issues not allowing learners time for learning off the job, not giving them time off the shop floor to meet with their assessor trainer. And the new standards, which is a day a week in effect, to meet the 20%, how will employers ensure that this 20% is fully met? And if, as I state, it's being checked where the employer is causing access issues, how can we ensure as work-based providers we are not penalised? Like I said earlier, you will be entering into a contract with the employer at the outset of the delivery of the apprenticeship, and within that contract it will stipulate your method of delivering off-the-job training. So, like I said, yes, access off the shop floor. The off-the-job can be delivered in the place of work, yes, as long as it's not in their normal place of work, and we'll be covering this in the next session. But you will have that contract there. So, yes, you will be penalised, but you'll be expecting, you will be putting into those contracts some form of clawback with that employer, and at the end of the day that employer will therefore lose their apprenticeship, and if they're a levy paying employer then that levy funding will remain unspent, and again the ESFA will ask them about their providing access to the 20% off the job and learners being able to take that time out to learn. Now that 20% of off-the-job training at the moment doesn't include maths and English. Maths and English is funded and delivered outside of an apprenticeship standard, although there is a requirement for them to have achieved a level of maths and English before they sit or start their endpoint assessment and can achieve their apprenticeship. It is delivered and funded outside of the apprenticeship. So moving on to the next slide, which I've kind of covered part of what the question related to, which is differences between SACE and apprenticeships standards. As I mentioned, there are some reviews of apprenticeships happening at the moment, and at present, and I believe the consultation closed in April, the retail standards level 2 and 3, and I believe the level 4 that was around as well, are under consultation for withdrawal from October. I've said October 18. I think it actually might be brought forward to April 18. So it looks like from April 18 there won't be a retail apprenticeship, SACE framework to be registered against from that point. So it'll only be the apprenticeship standards that you have available to you. So in terms of the difference, SACE does have limited flexibility to meet specific employability requirements. So within the retail apprenticeships frameworks at the moment, again, you have your qualifications, and yes, there are some, as I mentioned at the bottom, specialist pathways in the SACE frameworks, for example, garden centres. These aren't actually included within the apprenticeship standard. So the apprenticeship standard is aimed to be tailored to the specific subsector within retail that you're working within, so i.e. fashion, home DIY, garden centres, and electronic superstores, the ones off the top of my head that I can think of as different categories. So again, you would tailor the training to meet the needs of that employer in that organisation, but the minimum requirements of brand awareness, for example, still apply. So that's where SACE had its flexibility. Obviously, both, some similarities here, both have a minimum 12-month requirement, and both still do have a 20% off the job training requirement. So within SACE, there is a current 20% off the job training requirement, but at the moment, that isn't actually being monitored. And the government have realised that there are a lot of employers out there that are misusing apprenticeships potentially, and not necessarily the employers are allowing their staff time off the job to complete their learning. And this is how they're going to monitor it. They haven't said how they're going to be monitoring at the moment, other than stipulating it within the contract. But as it's mentioned, at the end of the day, providers are the ones that they cut at the sharp edge. Again, don't be afraid to use those contract terms to enforce that 20% off the job training. And don't forget, it can include internal training that employer themselves delivers, so health and safety, till training, brand awareness training, for example, anything they do with their employer brand can all be counted towards that 10%, that 20% off the job. So, as I said earlier, SACE isn't as detailed, so if I looked at the current qualifications within SACE and the requirements of the apprenticeship standard, if you were to do one of the current qualifications, which we are mapping across to the new apprenticeship standard requirements, rather than just doing a small number of optional units within the qualification, you would need to cover every optional unit in order to meet the requirements of the apprenticeship standard. So they are more detailed than the current SACE apprenticeship appears to be on paper. And I'm not saying it's not delivered in more detail in practice, but on paper that's the difference. So, as I said earlier, the main difference is there's no mandatory qualifications except maths and English. Whether that changes in the future, we're not sure, but at the moment, qualifications are not deemed necessary within a retail apprenticeship. SACE isn't as thorough. There are more optional in SACE and less mandatory compared to an apprenticeship standard. At the moment, obviously, an apprenticeship, SACE apprenticeship, is funded by the qualifications that you deliver. And that's how the funding is set. Going forward, funding is based on the overall delivery requirements, and that is something, as I'll come on to on the next slide, you will need to negotiate with your provider up to a cap. But funding for apprenticeships frameworks has changed as of the 1st of May as well, so I'll cover that on the next slide. Like I said earlier, standards do outline the minimum requirements that is needed for a retail occupation, either level 2, 3 or 4. An employer can request more, but again that is not funded as part of the apprenticeship, and the employer will have to pay for this themselves. And they can't use levy funding if they're a levy employer to pay for that additionality. The levy funding will only be paid up to the approved cap. So, as I said earlier, there is a mandatory cash contribution for an apprentice, and this will be monitored and it can't be delivered in kind. So there is a 10% requirement for an employer who is not a levy paying employer and has more than 50 employees. So we're looking at approximately £500 per learner on a non-levy paying and non-micro or small company. And that has to be paid across the length of the apprenticeship. And the ESFA have said that they will be monitoring the cash contributions paid by an employer via the ILR system on a quarterly basis. So an employer has to pay the full amount and over the 12-month period, but every quarter the ESFA will monitor to make sure that at least 1/4 of the required contribution has been paid at each point. So again, you can negotiate this with the employer. The employer may decide to pay the full 10% up front. They may decide to pay it on a monthly basis, or on a quarterly basis, or a 6-monthly basis. And again, you would use the ILR system to record the contributions and the auditors for the ESFA will expect to see evidence of receipted invoices as part of their audit functionality. So moving on to funding, which is one thing that most people are interested in. As I said earlier, there is a mandatory employer cash contribution. It's either 10% or 100% via the levy system. And as of the 1st of May, funding for all SACE apprenticeships will be reduced to £1,500 for all learners. Now, this is 16 to 18, 19 plus and 25 plus, and even those that are in large 1,000 plus employers. They will get £1,500 per learner, or you will get £1,500 per learner, or as a levy paying organisation, they will be paying £1,500 per learner. And this is just for SACE. Obviously, funding for retailer level 2 and retail team leader level 3 is £5,000 a learner, and for retail manager it is £6,000 a learner. So you can see the difference between the two types of delivery. And again, there will be some providers that will, and some employers that will stay with SACE for the time being, but some employers, especially those larger levy paying employers, will probably want to switch over to using more of their levy contribution as soon as possible. As I mentioned earlier, the cost of delivery and assessment is negotiated between the employer and the training provider up to the funding cap, so for example £5,000, and any costs of this have to be met 100% by the employer, and it's not levy fundable. So the employer comes to you and says, I would like to have this, this, this and this, and you say, okay, that will cost you, with the endpoint assessment, it will cost you £5,000. And that will either be a £500 contribution with £4,500 provided by the government, or we'll use £5,000 out of your levy contribution pot. The employer then comes to you and says, actually, I also need this. Okay, that'll be an extra £1,000 a learner. That will have to be paid for you directly. And that will again be part of the contract that you agree between yourself and the training provider at the beginning of the programme. As I mentioned earlier, endpoint assessment could be up to 20% of the overall funding cap. As an EPA organisation, we don't yet have a final EPA price. It is variable based on numbers of learners and locations of learners. So if you do have a EPA requirement, if you contact your account manager, then they can feed that back into us here, and we can look at EPA costs for your centre. As I said earlier, small employers that have less than 50 employees will not have to pay the 10% contribution if they take on a 16 to 18-year-old apprentice, unless of course their 50 employees are paid such fantastic salaries that they fall under the levy cap. The levy cap outranks any contribution requirements. So if they do have a pay bill of more than £3 million a year, then yes, they will have to pay a levy, and then they won't necessarily get the 10% contribution paid for. They will be paying for their apprenticeships out of their levy pot. And there will be some that possibly fall into that scenario, but not necessarily within the retail sector. If an employer has a relatively small levy pot, and potentially with the amount of apprentices they take on could spend that levy pot and over and above the levy pot, then funding will still be available to those employers on the co-funded rate. So they will be expected to make a 10% cash contribution to those apprentice starts, and the government will fund the remaining 90%. And once an apprentice starts on a set funding scheme, either levy or co-contribution, then they will stay on that scheme for the duration of their apprenticeship. So if that employer all of a sudden then generates more levy funding, then they will not switch their co-funded apprentices onto the levy funding pot. That levy funding pot will then remain available for new apprentices that will then be levy funded. And we will cover levy in a bit more detail across and funding across the next 2 webinars as well.